Hi and welcome to Legal Connect, the channel which helps you, the consumer, choose the right lawyer by location, price and service. In this video we meet Lucy Whittaker of Pragma Law. Lucy is a specialist motoring solicitor who helps clients across the UK. Lucy represents people facing everything from low-level speeding matters right up to the most serious of driving offences. Now before we start, here's a quick disclaimer. Legal Connect is not a law firm, and this video does not constitute as legal advice. It's been made for the purpose of entertainment only. In this interview, we ask Lucy a whole host of different questions relating to motoring law, and you can skip ahead to different parts of the interview by clicking on the timestamps. Thank you so much for your time. I know you're busy, you've got loads of stuff on, so I appreciate having the opportunity to come talk to you. Can you just start by telling us about you and about your firm?
Hey, I'm Lucy Whittaker. I'm a specialist motoring lawyer, solicitor. I set up Pragma Law in 2014, late 2014, after working at another firm for 8 years.
Right, and was that other firm, were you doing motoring law with the other firm then?
Yes, motoring and transport.
Right, and is that what you've always been involved in?
Since I qualified, that's all I've ever done, yes.
Is it? Why is that?
Because I enjoyed the mix of working in the office and doing what I think a proper lawyer gets to do, which is stand up in court and represent people. Okay, and what's that percentage out of interest? It varies, and I think it's changed now because obviously now I have my own business. I try and do a lot of cases myself, but depending on what's on, I've got to also be around to run the firm as well. So I would say that I try and be in court a couple of days a week, but that doesn't mean that there aren't weeks when I'm out far more than that, and the odd week where not so much.
Yeah. Do you ever have cases like that don't require you being in court? It could all be done?
Yes.
Really?
Lots of, yes.
So for example?
For example, cases where there appears to be a lack of evidence and we won't make representations to the police or the prosecution to sort of highlight what the issues are, or to ask them to consider the public interest test and ask them to review the decision about whether to proceed with it. So sometimes that can be dealt with. Also, there's a lot of cases that are dealt with under the single justice procedure. Now, motoring cases, most low-level ones, start off like that. And that was I think that came in about 2015. My memory is a bit, but it was a while ago now. And it gives defendants who are charged with summary-only offences, which means offences in the magistrates' courts that can only be dealt with in the magistrates' court, and that are generally non-imprisonable as well, to have their cases heard without having to go to court. That's not. I mean, there are certain exceptions, and there are only certain cases that can be dealt with that way. So a lot of people will receive these notices, and it doesn't mean actually they can be dealt with like that, but their cases may start out like that. So for that reason, it can sometimes represent people wherever they are, and it really has no bearing.
So tell us about the type of client that you represent then, whether that, regardless of what the sort of offensive, tell us about your client.
The majority of my clients, I would say, are people who are law-abiding citizens who have never done anything wrong before. I'm not saying all of them, but this is their first time having any involvement with the police or the court system, and it's quite sort of it's stressful for them.
I bet it is.
It's stressful. They will generally be upstanding members of society in terms of they've got a job and doing all things right, and they've made a mistake. That is a typical client. I mean, it's not just individuals. We do get businesses as well, because they can be charged with certain types of offences. It's only that tends to be more in relation to when there's a vehicle registered in a company's name, and a notice goes to them and they don't respond. So it's not so often, and so the majority by far are individuals, but most of them, as I've said, this is their first time having anything to do with the court, and we try and make it less stressful. Can't remove it entirely, but make it less stressful.
That's an interesting point, which is that you're representing sort of normal people that have, as you say, for the first time done something wrong, they found themselves in trouble. Is that predominantly at the lower level of the offence scale, or are we going right up to something extreme?
Right up.
Really?
Right up. I mean, for example, causing death by careless driving.
Right.
Represented people before who are older, like further on in their driving career, may have been driving for say 30, 40 years.
Right.
May have had a clean licence in all that time, never had an accident perhaps in all that time, and then they pull out of a junction to the path of a motorbike or something like that. The motorcyclist dies, and that's them in court, potentially facing prison as a result of it. So all types of offences. Obviously, there are some offences, like speeding is the most common, and I would say there's probably not that many people out on the road who've been driving for a while who've never had either points or a speed awareness course, especially with the number of cameras around nowadays. So that's of course the most common, but all the way.
And can you help on all aspects of the charges that someone can face? So let's say, for example, I had points on my licence, and I thought, rightly or wrongly, I contacted you and said, look, I've got these points, is there anything you can do with it? I mean,
well, not so much if you've got the points already, you've got to be facing some sort of a charge at that point.
So I've got a letter through the door that says, Mr. Gillespie, we caught you doing 60 and a 50, whatever it may be. Is there anything that can be done in those circumstances? Or
I'm going to have to say it depends. It's a lawyer answer.
Be ambiguous.
But it does depend. I mean, what I say to people is that even solicitors get points. You can't, no one wants points. And I know a lot of people say I'd rather pay a higher fine and not have the points. We can't do that. The law is the law. So we can only do what we can do realistically. But if you think that you weren't doing that speed, or we can check the paperwork and see if there's any procedural issues, or alternatively, if it's something that does appear to be made out, the offence is made out, we're looking at damage limitation, and that may be in terms of making sure you don't get disqualified, well, doing our best anyway, and just keeping the penalty to a minimum. But it's going to depend on each case, and until we see those papers, we don't know. But we do get quite a few calls from people who have just received a notice saying they were speeding, they've got no points on the licence, and they just say, how can I get rid of it? I mean, there's no obviously such thing as because the majority are brought, the cases, the charges are properly brought, but we find the ones that aren't, and if they are, then we'll find a way to mitigate it as best we can.
I suppose it's that balance of idealism and pragmatism, in that, of course, the client wants everything to stop and to get off with everything, but that's just not always possible to do that. You can't do that in other areas of law. Why would it be any different in motoring law? I
think there's a lot of false information on the internet, written by people who are not legally qualified, and it's sort of rumour. We do often get people who seem to think they know what the law says, and try and can often get themselves in a bit of a muddle, and would have been much better off just coming to us to start with, because they've taken someone's word for it. They've heard that this is, and then they've argued about it, and before you know it, rather than be offered a speed awareness course, now they're in court. We do get that.
It sounds like, was it that quote that said the man who represents himself in court has a fool for a client? That definitely applies in this instance then, that somebody who thinks they know, going onto a forum or just doing some basic research online, it sounds like they could get themselves in more trouble.
Yes, I think if they're looking on a forum to start with, they probably think they're looking for some sort of loophole or something like that, and I'd just be very careful about how reliable that information is. I'm not saying all of it, but you just don't know. And I appreciate that legal advice is not cheap and it's not free, because that's the way our justice system is. But often it can be far better to at least get that and be reassured that yes, this is what I'm doing the right thing, even if you don't want court representation. That at least you know that what you're doing is correct. Otherwise you can make things so much worse and end up costing yourself so much money.
Does that then make things too late to be repaired? Is there a point where, so if someone came to you and said, well look, I thought that I could do this and this was my outcome and I represented myself, can you now help me? You go, look, it's too late.
Well, it's only ever too late after they've been convicted, or they've pleaded guilty and been convicted, and the sentence is sound. I mean, I would like to say it's ever too late. I think it's always worth asking the question, because it depends. Even if you've got a trial listed tomorrow and you've pleaded not guilty, it's not too late. It may be too late necessarily to have someone represent you at court. You don't know, but I think we would still try and give someone a bit of help, or try and offer them a consultation if we possibly can, because you can still get credit and it can still make a difference to the cost that you're ordered to pay. If you go through a trial, it will cost, usually it costs a lot more. So I wouldn't say it's ever too late, but the earlier the better.
Yeah. So what would you say were the most common, what's the most common type of case that you handle?
Speeding by far.
Is it really?
Yes. Either a high level speed, such as in some way over the speed limit.
Right, so beyond a speed awareness course then?
There's different levels, so where there's a speed limit, there's always a set window for which you could be offered a speed awareness course, and then above that there's a slightly higher threshold for not being eligible for speed awareness but being eligible for a fixed penalty, and if you're not eligible for either of those, then it will go to court. Right. Where the sentencing guidelines are completely different, and just because you would have been eligible for a fixed penalty, if you don't take it up and you end up in court, it doesn't mean you'll still get the same penalty. So yeah, those are the different levels. And if it's in court, not always, but often it's because the court is looking at whether to disqualify you for the offence, either the offence because of the level of speed, but also possibly because you've got too many points on your licence. So yeah, it's a really good idea to get advice at that point. So yeah, speeding's by far the most common, but we deal with all sorts, careless driving, drink driving, drug driving, failing to give driver details. I mean, there's so many different ones that we deal with. Do you
ever get repeat offenders?
Yes.
Do you really?
Yes, cool. I mean, not too many, thankfully. I mean, most people, when they finish dealing with me, say, yeah, I hope I won't ever see you again in the nicest possible way. I get that a lot. But yes, we do get repeat offenders, of course.
I was thinking years ago, I had a girlfriend who was a criminal barrister, and she had particular clients that were just always in trouble. Yeah. And she loved it because the crimes that they committed were never that bad that they were going to be like locked away for years. But every time they did something wrong and they got caught, they just went back to her. Yeah. And she was like, this is great.
Yeah. Well, as I said at the beginning, most clients are first timers and have never had any involvement. But we do get people who come back for more. Yeah.
Wow, they don't take the hint that maybe.
Well, they make a mistake. I mean, that's the thing with motoring offences. Most of them aren't deliberate. You don't set out to do something wrong in most cases. Yeah. So they make mistakes, and we try and help.
I suppose the other argument of that is that you've also got those that are the sort of, there's a certain ignorance is there to motoring law. So I'm thinking, the boy racers that are souping up their cars and speeding and doing those things. That is an obvious. Okay, they've not set out to break the law, but it's closer to the boundaries of the law than anybody else that's just driving along naturally.
There are some. I mean, if you're talking about, say, dangerous driving, and I'm not saying, again, in all cases that it's a deliberate thing, but in some cases of dangerous driving, it can be pretty hard to believe that, weren't aware of quite what you were doing, but still not in all cases. There's sort of borderline. I mean, we all make mistakes when we're driving. That's why we have insurance. We have to have insurance because of it. So I'm quite sort of understanding of most people's position, which it's not for me to judge anyway.
Yeah.
But the longer I've done this and the more I deal with ordinary people who just make mistakes, the easier I find it to represent them. And I know there's people out there who think there should be very severe penalties for people who do these things, but they're generally good people making mistakes. But the consequences for them, if they lose their licence, can mean the loss of the job and everything that they've worked hard for. And whilst we can't always save that, I'll give it my best shot to minimise it as best I can if I can't defend it.
What's really interesting about that from the layperson's point of view is that I hadn't really considered the point that people that get in trouble with driving offences may not be doing anything deliberate, it may not be hostile, it could be an absolutely wonderful person that's just bad judgment that, ends up something terrible happening. But the level of empathy from your point of view in terms of making sure your understanding of the impact it may have on them because they're good people.
Yeah, I mean, it's not for solicitors to judge it, but as a human being, I appreciate why it's so important to people. I've heard a saying, I don't know who said it ages ago, where, I don't know, it may be something that other people have heard, but the closest most of us will ever get to prison is when we get behind the wheel of a car, because some of the cases, say particularly the fatals or serious injuries, where it's a careless driving, those sorts of cases, you just think that could have been me, any one of us.
Yeah.
No one's perfect. And if you make a mistake like that and someone dies, there's got to be consequences.
That's so sobering to hear that, actually. The closest you'll ever get to prison is when we're driving.
For most people.
Yeah. Wow. That's I mean, I'm also surprised as well by again, I'm obviously not a lawyer, but the amount of different offences that there are and the severity of some of them. I mean, let's just have a look at some of these driving laws. So one is dangerous driving. So can you tell us a little bit about that? What would entail dangerous driving?
Well, I can tell you the legal definition, which is driving that falls far below that of a careful and competent driver, and that it would be obvious to a careful and competent driver that it would be dangerous. Not very clear though, is it?
No, it's quite ambiguous.
It is, because it's still open to interpretation. I mean, there's so many sort of cases on this, and there's no set criteria. There's some guidance that says if one of these occurs, it's likely to be dangerous, but you've got to look at each case. Dangerous driving, though, does give you a criminal record, so it is a serious offence. It's a minimum 12-month ban unless you seriously injure or kill someone.
Right.
You can go to prison for it up to 2 years. So it's a serious one. But then if you go on the other end, there are other offences like causing serious injury by dangerous driving and causing death by dangerous driving. There are loads of them. Yeah. But at the top end, causing death by dangerous driving now, they changed the law last year, is maximum life imprisonment. So it's it's pretty serious stuff. It creates a sort of an odd position where one person can drive dangerously and not injure anyone, pure luck. The other person can do exactly the same course of driving but happens to hit someone, kill them. One of them's, facing a maximum of life in prison. Right. That hasn't happened yet in any cases, but I mean, that's the maximum. And the other person, the longest they can go to prison for is 2 years. One probably, almost certainly will go to prison, and the other one may not. So, and they've got no control, that's pure luck. Yeah. It's one of those it's one of those offences where you can get, your punishment can vary depending on pure luck, not necessarily what you did. And the same goes with careless driving offences as well. Careless driving, which is the one that's very easy to commit, because that's very similar wording to the dangerous driving that drops below that of a careful and competent driver, but not far below, just drops below. That one is, say, most people drive carelessly at one time or another. Again, not deliberately, but that's why we have insurance. Who's never pulled out and thought, oh, perhaps I should have left a bit more, or time, or made some minor error, and that's why we, as I say, why we have insurance. But if you do that and someone gets seriously injured or worse, you're looking at some very serious penalties, because that's what the law provides. And so you can get someone who pulls out of a junction and carelessly just causes the person behind, say, to have to brake, and it's especially with dash cam nowadays, people are submitting footage all the time. That's submitted, and perhaps they might get charged with careless driving. And then another person who does it, but there's a cyclist, and they knock them off, and totally different.
That's another topic. I mean, cyclists, we'll talk about that. We'll talk about that later on. But is the ambiguity or the flexibility, depending on how you look at it, is that a good thing or a bad thing?
I think you mean the different penalties depending on what happens?
Yeah, but also, you gave an example there of something similar happened where one person could be facing life, hypothetically, or a long time, another one depends upon the circumstances. Surely it depends upon the mood of the judge on the day.
Well, the sentencing guidelines, though, that say this, I think from one point of view, you're asking me to comment on what sort of the sentencing council have kind of already determined, so I don't want to be too critical, but I'll give you my view. I mean, as a defence solicitor, it seems a little unfair that you are not punished because of what you have done wrong. You've punished because of what has happened as a result, which may not have been foreseeable really to you. But if it had been my family member, if someone had died, I think giving them a fine and a few points wouldn't really cut it for me, to put it mildly. So I can see both sides, but I do think, particularly with careless driving, I do think there should be a little bit more emphasis on that person's driving record and what they have actually done wrong, as sort of perhaps a little bit more, because some of these people who make these mistakes have to live with that. Some of them have become quite very depressed, can't work, they just can't get over it. And then to know they've got a court hearing where the judge is going to tell, and they're going to have to hear about this person's family, which I guess is quite right, but they would never have deliberately hurt anybody. No. And then they might be sent to prison. Is quite. Yeah,
that's amazing. I'd never considered that. The fact that you raise, again, you make the point a few times about it's not your position to judge and all the rest of it, but actually that level of empathy for somebody who, the impact on the person who's committed this crime, who didn't mean to, would never have wished to have done that, has never done anything wrong in their lives, and the impact that has on them, not just in terms of, they'll lose their licence or go to prison, God forbid, but the impact it has on them personally and emotionally. Have you seen that happen to people then?
The police will normally offer them refer them and see if they want to be referred to get some counselling or get some help with it, which is right. It doesn't stop the prosecution.
No.
But I have seen people be incredibly low as a result of it, and feeling suicidal.
Really?
Absolutely. I think I'd really struggle. If I were in that position. I have seen that firsthand. I have seen it.
How do you, thinking about that point of the impact that you've seen this have on people who have unwittingly and without any hostile intent had this happen to them. How does that affect you? Does that impact you because we're all human, you know, that must be quite a difficult thing to deal with if you've got a client who's, you know, gone through the emotional roller coaster of whatever they're facing. I mean, what's that like from your perspective?
I have to try and keep my distance. I probably empathise more than I should at times, and I have to try and keep my distance. It's not easy, and just concentrate on doing my job, do my best for them, because I can't turn back time. There's nothing else I can do other than concentrate on doing my best.
Yeah. Are you able to switch off from things when you come out of court, or does it? Because I mean, it must be such a, you know, something hasn't gone your way, or you know that this person is just the perfect citizen and now they're in real trouble. I mean, I'd find that really difficult. I find some of the things I do on the other side of my work, I find really difficult to sort of, you know, forget. Does that impact you, or how do you deal with that?
It does impact me, but then the problem is well, it's not a problem, but the reality is you've always got another client you've got to represent the next day or whatever, so you have got to still focus. I think, fortunately for me, I don't get too many clients going to prison, but I don't think you ever get used to that. Sort of solicitors who are regulars in court can often can often know a few minutes before the defendant may what's going to happen. There's just certain things that happen in the courtroom that you kind of, if you're perceptive, you can tell what's happening. Well, you've got a very strong gut sense that this is what's about to happen, and then you hear, then just to confirm your suspicions, you hear the clink of the keys before before the dock sort of before the doors opened, and then so you never really it's always a horrible feeling because they're your client, and you will have you will have spent time speaking to them, you will have not got to know them, but
they're a person,
you know about their circumstances, and that's what my job is in court as well, is even when they've done something wrong, is I can't excuse it, but I'm trying to explain the reasons for it to the court and get the court to understand the positives of them and what they are like, and not just another statistic stood in front of them. And that's what I hope I sort of do best, is try and explain this person so that the court understands a little bit more. And as I say, it doesn't excuse it, but
So let's talk about, I know we mentioned it already, we mentioned dangerous driving, careless and inconsiderate driving.
Yes.
Can you tell me about that?
Well, the definition is driving that falls below that of a careful and competent driver. I know I've driven carelessly, not deliberately, at some point or another. I can't think of doing it recently, I must say, thankfully. And it's just pure luck as to whether A, it causes any damage to anyone else's vehicle, or B, whether you're seen by the police, C, whether someone's got dash cam. And it's just pure luck. And my view is that because that's why we have insurance, it doesn't really follow we need to prosecute every single time someone makes a mistake. Because there could be a claim on the insurance, they'll have to pay higher premiums, that's already dealt with. I do think sometimes there's a tendency that there seems to be prosecutions that follow. If the police are involved, they seem to want to prosecute all of them at the time. I'm not sure that's necessary unless someone's sort of repeatedly doing these things, because I think we all make mistakes, and that's not really what the criminal law is for. But it's going to depend. It's going to depend on the circumstances. But
it does seem a little bit that, you know, the standard that we all have to meet when we take our test. I'm sure if we all took our driving tests again, we probably wouldn't pass years later, we do silly little mistake, but we do, don't we?
Cross your hands over for starters.
Yeah, one hand, it's not at 10 to 2, and you know, all that stuff. But would hypothetically that be the benchmark of something that falls below whatever the definition was? You know, you didn't. I mean, my biggest fear when I drive is always my blind spot.
Yeah.
I'm absolutely paranoid about my blind spot. Even to the extent that when I've got my niece and nephew in the car who are like 10 and 12, I get them, I've checked, did you check my blind spot? It's like, it's a real thing, check your blind spot. If I didn't and I had an accident, could that be interpreted as the definition you just gave? So the benchmark is the standard by which we
I don't think you could use it as a defence that you've got your niece and nephew to check.
No.
Never run that one.
It wasn't that they checked it for me, it's that I checked it and I say to them, have you checked it? Because I want them. I want them to know, when you drive, for God's sake, always check your blind spot, even though they're years away from doing that. But is that the benchmark then? It's open to interpretation.
It is, and I think again it'll be different police making it, because they make the decision whether to bring the case. The police initially.
So would that change jurisdiction by jurisdiction then? Nottinghamshire Police versus the Met, or?
Yeah, it can do, but also by individual to individual. Just like in all walks of life, you'll get some people who are a little bit more forgiving than others.
Okay.
So I mean, I've got in my head there are certain forces who are, let's say, I know that we'll be up against it if we make any sort of representations. They don't seem to know what the public interest test is.
Really?
Yeah.
Police forces wouldn't know what
Well, they seem to interpret the public interest test as the same thing as the evidential test, which is there enough evidence to, upon which a reasonable jury could convict? So is the evidence there? And the second, and then also, is it in the public interest to proceed? Some people's view appears to be, well, the evidence is there, so it is therefore it's in the public interest, which isn't. That's not what the test is, but that seems to be their view. So
that's really interesting because, again, any lawyer that I speak to, there's always the argument, the rationale of just get the legal advice, just get the advice on your side, regardless of whether it's motoring, wills and probate, whatever it may be. In this example, the people that are prosecuting the person that's alleged to have done something wrong don't necessarily know the right understanding of that framework or that interpretation, which is a potential defence for the person that you're representing. So what you've just highlighted is one of the reasons why people should come to you, because really what you're able to do is to question whether the police have done something right or where those things are that make you go, look, you don't need to worry, or you've done this wrong.
I think so. A lot of the motoring offences will be prosecuted by the police. They can be different from some of the more serious offences where they kind of are passed from the outset to the CPS, the Crown Prosecution Service. Some of the lower level ones are prosecuted initially by the police, which means that a department within the police make decisions about what to put forward. Well, they will anyway, even in this other cases, but they're dealing with it at the early stages. And I feel, I'm not sure whether it's an issue of training or what, but some of them don't seem to be aware of the public interest test. That said, even if they are aware, you can always say, well, we think it is in the public interest, and I can't force them to back down if that's their view, but the difficulty is I'm not always sure they're applying it correctly, and you might get a one-line response saying, we feel it is in the public interest. You can write a great big long letter with really sensible points, and you get a response.
Computer says no.
Essentially, I mean, down the line, because you've always got the right to plead not guilty, down the line you can ask the CPS, because it will get passed to the CPS if you plead not guilty. You can ask the CPS to review it, and they will often take a different view from the police about whether it's in the public interest. I guess partly because they're lawyers, which is obviously a good thing, so they do know what the test is, or should, and then also, I suppose a little bit, they're dealing with quite serious offences, so maybe they're a bit better placed to to assess whether this really warrants prosecution or not. But yeah, you can only make the point if they decide they want to take the matter to court and they want to prosecute, they want to proceed and push ahead with it. You've got to. You can't change their mind. Some people, once they've said, we know what it's like. If someone's made their mind up, they're going to. If you keep pushing against it, they're going to just dig their heels in. And the courts can't consider the public interest test. So if the police or the prosecution are proceeding with it, then the courts can't interfere really with that. That is, they can only decide on guilt or not, and then the sentence. They can't say. You might get a judge who might comment and ask them to have consider reviewing the position, but only when it's pretty obvious. Other than that, it's entirely down to the prosecution.
So what sort of geographical locations do you cover then? Where are your clients based?
Well, we're based in Nottingham, but we go, everywhere we need it, if I'm honest with you. It will depend on the case, but I wouldn't want to put anyone off contacting us just because they think they're too far away, because they're probably not. And so many are dealt with by paper as well now, with the single justice notices, that often it really doesn't matter where you are. It just may depend on the nature of the case. If you want court representation, of course, if it's down in Cornwall or something, then that may be, we've got to factor that in. But also some courts are letting us appear remotely. That's the other thing. One semi-good thing to come out of COVID is that the court was forced to put in place really a facility for representation remotely, and that has stayed. It's no longer routine, like you don't just get granted it routinely or if you can't be bothered to go to court. But bearing in mind in motoring cases where it's almost always privately funded, they're paying themselves and it's not legal aid, it's in the interest of justice generally, if they can get the same representation but the solicitor or barrister be appearing remotely, it may be better to do it that way. There are some limitations, there are some hearings it's not really sensible to do remotely. And it is assuming that the technology is working properly, because I did do a very short hearing a few months back where there was so much interference I couldn't really hear what the court was saying very clearly at all. And I certainly was glad that was a relatively short, straightforward hearing that I went in, got what I wanted and finished. But if it had been anything more complicated, I just wouldn't have been able to proceed. It wouldn't have been fair, because I couldn't really. It just wasn't clear. And there are some drawbacks to not being physically there. You don't get to, for example, speak to the prosecutor if any issues arises. You can't just so easily ask the step out and speak to the prosecutor or show them something. That you can't really have those discussions. It's just all of a sudden you're on the screen, off you go. So horses for courses, but it's not. It just means that there is potential for us to represent people wherever, and we will explain to them what the pros and cons are, and then it's up to them. That's something that's come up with some of the other lawyers that I've interviewed recently, is the effect of COVID and how that's made this possible. And I suppose for the benefit of anybody watching this that's looking for, you're a specialist motorist lawyer. That's all we do.
That's all you do.
Every day.
Focused on that, and have done for a number of years. That the potential client has the benefit of experts. Let's say someone's in London. They get experts at regional prices, which are going to be different from the law firms that are in central London that are charging a lot more. So there's value to the consumer there, isn't there? I would say so. I mean, I don't know what a general criminal type lawyer, I mean, that's not a specialist motoring, but what a sort of a non-corporate London lawyer, what their rates are compared with ours. But I would have thought that even with our travel, we're fairly competitive because we're not in London.
Yeah, it may not be quite the same as if we're doing it in a local court, but when compared with a firm local to London, because of their rent rates and everything else, it may be that we are still very competitive.
So even though you're East Midlands based, you will travel. Some cases don't necessarily have to be there because it can be dealt with, through paper and emails. But you will travel to courts to represent the clients, and that means even someone like you said in Cornwall, that can all be factored in. It's just the practicality from the client's point of view, which is there's going to be a slightly higher cost relative to travel and time. So really, you're nationwide, aren't you?
We are nationwide, but we're just always upfront about if it's because of the location, it's going to increase our fees. Yeah. We do say that. Yeah. We do explain that to the client.
Wouldn't the client expect that though?
Well, yeah, it's then open to them if they want to find, but I'm just saying we're upfront, so if they then want to think, well, I don't want to pay that, I'm going to try and find someone local, well, that's fine. If they feel as confident in them, then that's absolutely fine. But it's their choice.
Yeah. And I suppose as well, you could have a client, I'm thinking, that could contact you from anywhere for a Zoom consultation, a phone consultation, just to go through their case in a bit more depth, that doesn't necessarily require you having to, any being in court or anything like that. Surely they could pay for your time just to get your opinion on their circumstances.
That's how we start with all our cases anyway. Right. Even unless it's a very last minute instruction. Yeah. All our cases we start with a consultation, because that way, we do charge for that, but it's a fixed amount, and that way people know what they've got to budget. We're going to give honest advice. We're not going to try and tell someone they've got a case when they haven't, because it's our reputation at stake anyway. We want to do what's right for the client. We're getting paid for our time, and we'll be honest about the prospects, and then they can make an informed decision. Do they want to spend more money? Do they want representation? What their options are? And they can decide. Or they may say, well, I'm glad I just know where I stand now. I'm going to deal with it myself, or I'm going to plead guilty. Whatever it is they're going to do, but they know that they've not missed something. Yeah. Or they're not going to walk out of court thinking, I wish I'd have got some advice. Would that have been different? So that's how we start all of our cases. And we give the written advice as a result of that. But sometimes we are just giving almost preemptive advice, and they haven't been charged with anything, and people just want that advice, and that option's still there. Whereas other people will prefer to wait until if and when they've been charged with something, rather than perhaps spending money they may not need to spend. It just depends on the individual.
Yeah. And that's the process then. So anyone that's looking for a motoring lawyer would contact you to arrange a consultation. What do they do? Would they email you? They call you? Is there an online booking system? Or
on our website, there's different ways of contacting us. So we've got the phone number on there. There is there's a contact form, there's an email, and there's a WhatsApp as well. So any of those ways, and we're pretty good at responding quite quickly. Yeah. Even out of hours, we can't guarantee it, but we do our best, even if it's just a message just to say we can't talk at the minute, but we'll give you a call in the morning. So that's how most people, that's the way to contact us, really. Yeah.
And how long does a consultation take?
I generally say, it depends on what it is, but I generally say sort of allow up to an hour, although I did one this morning that was over an hour, but it is what it is. There are some cases where I'm almost giving an advice based on, it's almost a legal point, and I'm looking at the papers, so I don't really need to take lengthy, detailed instructions, because I'm looking at whether there's been some error. But so that might be way shorter. There's the odd one I've done where I've only been on the phone 10-15 minutes, but that's not the norm. I would say a general case would sort of, I'm on the phone for more like 45 minutes, I would say, but it's their consultation, so it depends what they're trying to get out of it and what they need.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned there that you write up notes after, so there's like a report after.
So I always write up again, it does depend on what I think is best, what the client needs. If we're likely to be representing them in court at some point, or maybe, we'll do a summary of what that client has told us as well, so that, because months may pass and we'll speak to many people, we don't forget it's our point of just a reference document, but also just to confirm with the client that what we think they've told us, we've understood correctly. There's nothing that, we've got wrapped around our neck, or afterwards they think, oh, I forgot to tell them that. You can add that in. It's just sort of work in progress. And to just make sure that when we're then giving advice, that it's based on correct instructions. So we do that, and we send an advice letter as well, just confirming our advice, most of which obviously should have been confirmed during the consultation, but there'll be a lot to digest. So it's just in writing, and then that person can reflect on it. In different cases, we may also be sending other letters, like if we're writing, we've suggested we write representations, and we send those things, or mitigation, whatever it is. But it just depends on what the case is and what that person wants to do.
Yeah, and what's the process then after that? So I know it's probably case by case, but
I am going to say that, aren't I?
But well, it has to be, isn't it? There's nothing sort of off the shelf here, is there? It's absolutely bespoke relative to that individual circumstances. It
is. I think if it was that formulaic, we wouldn't have much of a role in it. And it's also down to the individual and what they want. We can only advise and give options, and then it's down to, and also advise obviously about cost, because in reality, costs are an issue. Yeah. People might want, in an ideal world, might want to take everything to trial. I'll just take my chances and go to trial, but that's going to cost money. Yeah. And depending on what the consequences are, they may or may not want to go down that route. So it will depend. In that advice letter, we will either, if someone's firm on their instructions already, we'll confirm what we're going to do. We'll put what our further steps are by us, further steps by you. Or there'll be options, for you to confirm if you want to do this, or they might want to have a think about it. That's fine, but we will diarise the deadlines and make sure we don't miss any of those in the meantime. So but it will depend. Usually we'll have to enter a plea. We will often do that. If possible, we'll do it in writing if it's single justice. But if it's, say, a drink driving offence, something like that, and there's a court hearing, the person will often be on bail. You'll have to go to court anyway.
Right.
There are exceptions to these things, but
it is just case by case.
It is case by case. I mean, I've been doing this for a long time, and it's hard to, some clients do want to sort of know everything. But I can't really impart all of my knowledge in sort of a nutshell, because part of my experience is knowing. It's all very well when things just go to plan. It's knowing what to do when things don't go to plan, and that's something you only learn over doing it for years and years, which is what I've been doing. Because there's always not always, but in some cases there's something completely a curveball that's thrown, and you've got to know how to deal with it. Yeah.
That's why they're paying you though, right? I mean, that's the whole point. You're the expert. In fact, one of the questions, just slight detour, was how often do driving laws change? Well, not the fundamental stuff, not that often. Of course, we've had new ones brought in July 23. I say, of course. Obviously, we've all read it.
With these additional causing serious injury by careless driving and some other ones, but that's one of the sort of major ones. And then there's been changes to the maximum penalties, which are changes been brought in by legislation. But then you get ones, they tend to more bring in new ones, extra ones to catch motorists, it feels. Really? There's other things you can do wrong. I mean, one of the bigger changes was, again, I can't remember when this was. I don't know if it was 2013, 2015. 2015 seemed to be a time when things changed. But with the drug driving, whereas pre that change, they had to show you were impaired, whereas now, if you just got it in your system, you've had it. Well, not you've had it, because but it's enough to have it in your system if they can prove that in that you were driving or attempting to. So that changed, but I wouldn't say the legislation is changing that regularly. There's always cases, and that is one of the things I do like about this area, because I've always enjoyed the legal bits where you have to go back to researching cases and interpreting stuff, which when I was training and did other areas, I didn't really get the opportunity. It was quite repetitive, and whilst there is the element of that, I am researching things every week. There's things I'm learning, I would say, or refreshing my memory about, probably not learning, but clarifying, because this person's case is different, is the case that deals specifically with this. So that's always evolving, and that's really interesting to me. Yeah.
But on that point then about laws changing, what happens to motoring law when we see this sort of evolution of cyclists, e-scooters? We see what happens with, if there's an incident, can a cyclist be charged for motoring offences?
Well, not in the same way. There is specific legislation for cyclists. And
do you cover that?
I've never had to, truth be told, because I don't see them being charged. I'm not saying it never happens, but bearing in mind the penalties aren't very severe.
Right.
For talking about a regular cyclist, which covers there's very technical bits about. It applies to some offences and not others, actually, when we're talking about e-bikes. But so I've never had to deal with that, to be honest. But in answer to what happens to the law when these new inventions come in, is that the answer is it just doesn't keep up. Really? It's always behind, and it's still behind now. We've got a strange situation where at the moment e-bikes are legal. That's fine. You don't need insurance. You don't need a license for an e-bike. Scooters, different matter. And logically, it doesn't make a great deal of sense why the e-bikes are okay, e-scooters are not. But the reason for it is that e-bikes have been around longer. There is legislation which exempts them from being classed as motor vehicles, so that the Road Traffic Act and the offences that are contained within them will not apply generally to an e-bike, purely because it is adapted so that it can be propelled with pedals. And a scooter it's only real, apart from pushing it a little bit. Its only form of propulsion is the motor. Right. So at the moment, there's been no legislation to include those at the moment, and I'm not entirely sure what the appetite generally is, because I think logically there's not really a great deal of difference in terms of their danger, but then there's a lot of people who think they're a real nuisance. Because perhaps people, I don't know. There seems to be, certainly the perception may be that e-scooters are not always ridden as responsibly, maybe. There's certainly been a lot of stuff in the news.
You're being very diplomatic.
I am, yeah. I'm not saying it's my view, I'm just saying that that's in the news. There's certainly been a lot of, if someone's knocked over by an e-scooter, then it will make it into the news. I don't think if someone ran into you with a bike and knocked it would necessarily be quite so. It
is a bit of a hot topic, actually, isn't it? The role of e-scooters and bikes and cycle lanes and motorists and all of those sorts of things. That's fascinating, though. So the law is obviously always behind, because something's got to happen to then trigger the law to change. But in this instance, an e-bike is classed differently than an e-scooter.
Yes.
So how does that affect you if you're the motorist and they hit you, or you haven't caused it, you're on the receiving end?
Well, at the moment, the position is the same in terms of, if you ride an e-bike or you ride an e-scooter, you're not going to have insurance, are you?
No.
That doesn't mean that and we're getting into civil law now, and that's not
Yeah.
my bag, but that doesn't mean that person's not liable. It's just whether they've got any money or insurance to cover it. So that's that's a civil issue, but it's whether or not the rider of that vehicle is going to be charged with an offence or not, or can be. So that's the main difference. It's a difficult one at the moment with the e-scooters. I mean, they're being sold. There's shops that sell them, and the reason they're not legal. Well, what makes them illegal? There's no such law that says you are not allowed to ride an e-scooter. What makes them not legal is the fact that it's classed as a motor vehicle, and when you ride or drive a motor vehicle, you need a licence to do it, and you also need insurance. Well, if you can't get insurance, then you're not going to be legal.
Yeah.
And everywhere it's sort of, they are putting in, often in very small writing, these people who are selling them, that you cannot ride them on a road or a public place. You can it's only illegal to ride them on private land. But they're selling them. How many people have got a garden,
an estate,
worth riding a scooter? Yeah, exactly. And these are being sold. And I do feel it's a little bit unfair. I mean, I think nowadays there's a bit more awareness about the fact most people know you're perhaps not allowed to ride these, which is maybe where you see so many people riding them wearing balaclavas and that sort of thing. But I do think it was can be a bit unfair that you see them, it normalises it, and then the odd person will be prosecuted for it. And I think more should be done to educate people before they start. Yeah. And the number of, especially students, unfortunately, who I've represented as well, who have gone out drinking and thought they'd make their way home on an e-scooter. Well, that's drink driving, just treated the same as a car.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow, that's incredible.
It's a motor vehicle. The fact that, if you crash, you're highly likely to hurt yourself, really. I mean, it's not the same, is it? They wouldn't have dreamt of getting behind the wheel of a car.
No, they wouldn't.
Most of these people, and they just didn't. They thought it was like getting on a bike.
So you've seen that happen.
I've represented people.
So you've represented students that have had a few drinks, got on an e-scooter,
yes,
and then got in trouble.
Yeah, they get a ban. They get a ban. They're treated like it's a car.
Yeah, but they don't know that, or they don't realise that.
Yep.
Wow, that's incredible. In fact, that was one of the other questions: is what advice would you give, having represented people across a whole range of different motoring offences? Do you see common mistakes? Because we've talked about the innocence of people getting involved in stuff that they didn't mean to do and all the rest of it. Is there any advice to anyone watching this? This is like, I want to avoid. I'm terrified by that quote you said earlier about the closest you are to prison is when you're driving. What can people do to sort of protect themselves from your perspective? So I'm thinking dash cam.
Dash cam is great, and I have it. But it can incriminate you as well if you do something silly. I mean, if you're trying to do things right, dash cam is a good idea, I think. I've just dealt with a case whereby, I've dealt with cases in the past where it appeared on the face of it that it was, so a vehicle's gone into the back of another vehicle. It appears on the face of it like it's the vehicle at the back's fault. Dash cam shows it's not.
Right.
That it is a case of a slamming on of brakes for no reason by a car in front. And without that dash cam, it would have been very hard. You wouldn't know.
Yeah.
So dash cam's really useful. There's only so much you can do.
Yeah.
It's luck.
Yeah.
Just concentrate, don't
super
your
careful.
Best. Use cruise control, that's my top tip.
Is it really?
Yeah, I use it everywhere.
Do you?
Even in 30s.
Yeah.
Because most people, if they use it, they'll use it only on the motorway.
Yeah.
I'm probably doing myself out of work here.
No, you're being honest, but yeah.
I do because it's, cruise control, and then you can concentrate on what you're doing.
Yeah.
Rather than looking down every 2 seconds.
Yeah.
it's not really an exciting top tip. It's pretty, but it sounds
Yeah.
silly. How many people when I say to them, have you looked at cruise control? Have your car got it? Yeah, but I don't know how to use it. It usually takes 5 minutes for you to read them. It's dead easy.
If that.
If
fact,
that.
It's clicking a button, isn't it? I've got it.
But to understand how to use it, as soon as I swapped my car, I was straight on how do we use cruise control. Because it certainly worked for me.
Yeah.
Especially when you're on unfamiliar roads, because you want to be looking at the road ahead, not on your speed.
Yeah.
So I think we're fortunate in that respect now that most vehicles have got that, so use that. But there's so many cameras around now. So many cameras around now that it just...
Yeah, okay. That's interesting about the dash cam. It's an important thing, but it could be a double-edged sword
I've
if
seen
you're
it
the one.
work against someone.
Have you?
Yes.
Right. So, tip of the day is have a dash cam, but be aware.
But you've got a dash cam and it's recording you.
I'll just put that away. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, this particular dash cam recorded not only driving that was below par, but also comments kind of it also captured the sound, and you can turn that on and off.
Right, okay.
I don't know why particularly you'd want that, but capture you singing in the car. But they also had the sound, and it showed them. It showed their intent, like in terms of racing someone else. And
right. Okay.
Really not.
Yeah, not good.
Very damning evidence. I mean, it made it very clear what advice I'm giving.
Yeah.
But it can work against you. But I mean, it shouldn't. In most cases, it should protect you.
So what advice would you give? We know that you're based in the East Midlands, but you nationally you help clients all over the country in various capacities. If someone's watching this and they're thinking about hiring a motoring lawyer, what should they be looking for? What advice would you give to someone in terms of choosing the right person to represent them?
I mean, first of all, you probably want a specialist. That's not saying that it's always essential, but if you had a medical problem, you'd kind of want a specialist. So if we're doing it day in, day out, so we tend to have the answers to most things off the top of our head, and anything we don't, we'll find it very quickly. Make sure that the person you're speaking to is sort of clear about fees, for sure, and what they can do, and be wary of any lawyer who's advising you to plead not guilty without having seen any papers or anything like that, because that's...
Is that a red flag?
Yes, it should be.
Okay.
It should be. I mean, there are absolutely cases that you should be pleading not guilty in. And we do it in a lot of cases, but we certainly don't advise it before we've seen the papers, because there are consequences of pleading not guilty, and it can make things worse. So absolutely we will advise those, please, but we need to see things properly. Make sure you feel, I guess, comfortable with the person you're talking to, and that they you will generally get a sense of whether they know what they're talking about or not. I mean, we tend to, when you ring us, you're speaking to a solicitor from the off, unless we're unavailable, and then we will be ringing back. So it will be a qualified solicitor that when we return calls. I know that's not the same for all firms, and I guess check who will be dealing with your case is worth knowing as well.
What can they check in that respect?
Well, ask. I don't mean, you obviously can't check in any other way, but sometimes things aren't kept in-house routinely. There are times when we do have to use external counsel or occasionally agent solicitors, but we only give cases so I will only give my cases, if it's not me dealing with it, to another an advocate who I know and trust. I won't just be ringing round chambers and the cheapest person gets it. It doesn't work like that. That's not how I want to run my firm. It's all about reputation and quality and doing a good job. So but I know that that's not the same across. Yeah,
and actually that's one good point, without naming any names, but how would somebody watching this know how to find out about someone's reputation, and are there online reviews, are there testimonials, are there things like that?
There are online reviews, and we do pride ourselves on our reviews. I'm a little bit wary though sometimes, because I know that I am contacted every couple of weeks by some person who wants to write fake reviews for me for a fee, and I always report it. I mean, to Microsoft, whether they do anything with it, I don't know. So be a little bit wary, but I mean, if you read them, you can generally, I think, tell if they're likely to be from genuine people or not. But hopefully when you ring up as well, you'll get a sense of the person and see whether they... Is there an issue as well, you mentioned about that, if you speak to someone and they just say, plead not guilty, that just general advice is not so great. Are there issues in the clarification of fees then? Do you see people getting stung with particular... Yes.
That's a problem.
So the cynic in me would say that if you plead not guilty, the more court hearings there's going to be, the more work there's going to be.
Oh, okay.
So
more billable hours.
There's more to do. Is that really what's in the best interests of your clients? It may be, and that may, but that should be an informed choice after they've had advice. So that's my concern. Yeah. Okay. With it.
And then just finally, just a couple of things. You've mentioned a couple of times when we've spoken about aspects of this job where you've talked about things that you particularly enjoy. I get the impression you like being in court, something you enjoy doing.
I like being, I do like being in court.
What is it about being in court that you like?
What do I like about being in court?
Because some
I've got control over it, and I feel I can, it depends what I'm doing. There are some cases that are tricky and you've got to really think about how you're going to present this. On others, you just feel like you are fighting the person's corner, and I think if you can put it forward with a little bit of, I don't know, and enthusiasm is not the right word, but explain it in a way that's not monotone and very dull, that they're switching off, and explain to them in a sort of in a way the court can understand, and also not waffle on for ages, because I don't think that helps. You can tell when the court's listening to you, so make sure that you're just telling them in a way that they understand. And I think it can make a real difference, and it can make as well that your client will come out of court feeling that their points were put across, and that's what you're there to do. There are, of course, times when the points they want putting across aren't always helpful, so you have to, that's for you to sift out, but they will come out feeling they've had the best shout.
So is it the almost the advocacy skills then, of being able to put what could be emotive or complex issues clearly, to influence, to communicate as well as you can?
Yes, definitely, and I think that comes from a confidence that we know our stuff as well. It's unlikely we're going to be in a courtroom with someone who knows more than we do. So you're kind of fairly confident.
That kind of puts the element of communication for a lawyer, and I know it's relative to the type of lawyer, but you must have the ability to communicate effectively with the client and maybe sometimes put the emotion to one side, be clear and concise, evaluate what's going on, communicate with that person, but then also do it effectively on a stage. Yes,
and I think I don't class myself as a typical, what people might think as a typical lawyer. I think it's about quality, not quantity, and when you're talking and making sure you're engaging with people. So standing up and just liking the sound of your own voice waffling for ages, which I've seen a lot of much more very experienced advocates do, is not necessarily the way to do it. But I don't think there's that much difference if you're explaining things to a client, explaining things to the court, especially in the magistrates' court, where the magistrates are legally trained but not legally qualified, and some will be more experienced than others. You're really explaining it to them in the way they can understand which is what you're doing with the client. So it is different when you're before a judge and if you're in the Crown Court, but it is quite similar. So you're quite used to explaining your thought sort of in a logical way, why you are asking the court to do what you would like them to do. Yeah, and that just comes with experience as well. Yeah.
But you also mentioned like the technical side as well. So, you know, the research, the detail with case. What is it that you like about that? Because it's not for everyone, is it? I mean, I
don't know why people don't like it though. So it's hard to say why they don't like it.
Why do you like it?
I just find it so interesting. I mean, this is why I like this bit of law. I like to be learning. I like to be getting, even if it's not, there's nothing like brand new, groundbreaking, or I didn't know that before, but there's still the odd little thing that you'll come across that you thought, oh, that's interesting, and it will sort of, I'll lock it up here for another time. But I mean, when I did my law degree, I really enjoyed all the sort of academic side of it, and the reality of being a solicitor in, I think, a lot of areas is nothing like. You probably don't get to go into the law and reading cases very often at all. Whereas for me in this, I'm doing that all the time, probably read more, sometimes almost read out of just a pure interest because I want to know something. It's not... I'm a little bit, I do like that. I'm perhaps a little bit unusual in that sense.
But you're clearly passionate about the topic, because if you're reading it outside of the requirement, there is an element of passion to it. There must be.
I mean, don't get me wrong, I don't sit and read this in the evening.
Or weekend.
No, but I just find the sort of the reasoning behind things, the logic of why this is why it is, and I find that really, I just find that really fascinating, especially the higher court judgments. I just find that really interesting when they're considering all the different points.
As a general overview, obviously there's lots of different areas of law. What skills, or what do you think makes a good lawyer? What are the key skills someone needs to have?
Depends what you mean by a good lawyer, doesn't it? Because sort of, some people will say it depends how much money you can make. But when you say an effective lawyer, as in from the client's perspective, that's different, isn't it? That they don't care how much you're making. Well, I think one of the biggest things is to do what you say you're going to do, because lawyers are notoriously criticised for can't contact them, can't get hold of them, chasing them. How many times I've seen that, rang them, left a message, no one ever, they didn't want to know. After they've got my money, they're not interested. And we try to be exactly the opposite of that. And so that's one of the big things, because I think when people complain about their lawyers, it's generally, and this is an assumption, but I think it's not always about the advice, it's about the service that they're getting. So I've got control over that, and I will make sure that it's as good as it can be. There are perhaps some people who've got slightly unrealistic expectations, and yes, occasionally when you message me at the weekend, I will try and reply, but there are times when I might not be able to, so it's not, I can't do it absolutely every single time, but we will generally try. So that's a real big one, but someone who's got attention to detail and is specialist is ideal, because means they're doing it day in, day out, and you're not picking up a whole new area of law and having to research it. I might occasionally, the little things I want to double check, but I know most of this stuff. I do it every day. It's
sort of, I get the impression that, and it's not been said, but I get the impression with all the things that we've discussed, that what really matters to you is the quality of what you're offering, which everyone can say, oh, we always care about quality and this, that, and the other. But actually, you are looking at this from the perspective of everything is about what's right for the client. Initial consultation will give you the advice. If you want us to help, we can. you must take pride in what you're doing, because like you said, it's your reputation, it's your business. One thing I found with different legal cases that I've personally been involved in when I've instructed lawyers myself is exactly that. I've spoken to numerous lawyers and it's like, well, how many of these actually seem to care? And how many of these have just given me a flat fee and said, well, you pay that and then we'll have a chat? And it's like, well, I didn't trust them. I didn't get that empathy. It was just a transaction. That's all it was. Yeah. And actually, you're saying that at the heart of this, and again, I didn't really appreciate it, is somebody that's going through a really terrible time, rightly or wrongly, and they need that support and care to know that they're being looked after, because it could change their life completely.
Yeah, either a really terrible time, or in the other side of things, nothing that major, but they just haven't got time to deal with it.
Right, okay.
And they kind of almost just want to pass it over. I can't always do that. It depends what it is. Yeah. But there are occasions where I certainly have kind of I've given them some advice. Say, look, this is what's going to happen if you deal with it yourself, or you can pay me and I'll deal with it. And probably a similar thing is going to happen. We might get a slightly better result. Yeah. And then I'm happy for you to deal with it. Okay, fine. That's happy with that. I'm fine with that. Yeah.
Lucy. If you want to contact Lucy to see if she can help you with a case, you can find her contact details in the description box below. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and if you're interested in this area of UK law, have a look at some of the other videos that we have on this topic. Thanks for watching.